vaccination and masking. In particular, we took in a couple of shows on Broadway. You have to be vaccinated and masked in order to get in. But in general, it's more of a laissez-faire. In any case, good to be back here in terra firma, Artseinu Hakdosha. So we want to dedicate this Shiur to a former rabbi of mine, a rabbi to many thousands of people, Rav David Lieberman. He was actually my bar mitzvah teacher as well as the rabbi of my shul growing up in Chicago, and later on would return to Antwerp, where he was born, become the chief rabbi there. I spoke to his grandson just a few hours ago, maybe a little longer, just before I left the States. And he's runs the Chabad house in Victoria, British Columbia. Told me that his grandfather had been rabbi of a shul for 70 years. Very difficult for anybody to match that accomplishment. And he was rabbi actually in Chicago, then Detroit, then Brussels, and then finally in Antwerp for the last 36 years. And I had the opportunity a few years ago to see him. I hadn't seen him in 40 years. He remembered me immediately. He had a tremendous, clear mind. He passed away. Today is his funeral. Passed away yesterday at the age of 96. And up until 3 weeks ago, I received a video on the Parsha every week from him. So tremendously active and amazing person. The story I always tell about him is that many years after my bar mitzvah, when my father, Oliver Shalom, whose yortzeit was actually yesterday as well, when he was moving out of the house, and we looked through the closets and shelves, and we found an old tape recorder, which in those days required a David Moshe Lieberman. Thank you for that note there. Just in terms of his name, also grandfather of Mendy Shittrick, etc., and many other rabbis in his family. In any case, I found this tape recorder, and it required two types of batteries to play it, one for the moving the reel to reel and the other for the sound. And it was Rav Lieberman Zatzal who was teaching me my bar mitzvah parsha of Akev. And as I played it, I listened to him correcting me and telling me about all the mistakes that I had made when practicing the laning. And it was just such a pleasure to hear somebody of that caliber who was criticizing me and yelling at me for not knowing the laning as well as I should have until that point. So I think I did okay in the end. But I always say that the rebuke of a tzaddik is much more valuable than the praise of a regular person. So I'm very indebted to him for many, many years of inspiration. And his neshama should have an aliyah. And I'll mention also my father, who was yortzeit also, both of them on Chaf Daled Shvat. All right, we're going to talk about Mishpatim. It's a very, very full parsha. It has 53 mitzvot within this parsha, but I want to basically center on one. I hope I'll get a chance to briefly mention a couple of others. And just a tremendous amount of information and discussion on two little words that appear in the parsha, and that is almost parenthetically in the story of two people fighting, and one injures the other. So the pasuk says that, well, the injured party receives compensation from the person who injured him, and that includes medical treatment. V'rapo yirapeh, says the pasuk. This is pasuk Yud Tet, somewhat near the beginning of the Sedra. And from these two words, although Rashi doesn't indicate, we learn that a doctor has permission to heal. Now, this may seem very obvious to most people. Yeah, that's what doctors do. But it's not so simple. In fact, no less an authority than the Ibn Ezra, who himself was a doctor. As we'll talk about, as we know, Jews make the best doctors. And I won't go into the whole litany. You can research this of all the great political leaders going back many, many centuries, almost 2,000 years, always chose Jewish doctors. And to this day, of course, and I'll tell a couple stories about that later, there have been outstanding Jewish physicians. But the Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 12th century in Spain, was a doctor as well. He said that really this permission to heal applies to wounds that are externally visible, but all internal illnesses are in God's hand to heal. And he quotes the pasuk that we know very well, Ani Hashem Rofecha, I am Hashem, your doctor, so that we should rely on Hashem. But of course, we know that this is not the majority opinion. We know that we do depend on doctors to heal externally, internally, prescribe medicine, surgery, etc. In fact, the Shulchan Aruch, which voices the majority opinion, says clearly that doctors have an obligation to heal the sick and to save lives. And if they refrain from doing so, they are actually considered to have shed blood. So it's not even optional for them. Rapo yirapeh doesn't only mean, and the double phraseology, which we'll talk about in a moment, that they are allowed to treat the sick, but they are required to. Tosfot asks the question on this pasuk and says, why could we not learn permission to heal simply from the word v'rapo, and he shall heal? Why do we need the double phraseology? So he answers, because then we would say that doctors can only heal an injury which one person inflicts upon another. But if one heals a disease that does not come at the hand of another person, but comes from heaven, he seems to contradict the heavenly decree. Therefore, the double verb, v'rapo yirapeh, to tell us that any kind of disease not only can, but should be healed by physicians. This became, as some of you know, a major, I won't say debate, but subject of discussion when the AIDS crisis first began, from people questioning, this was one of the first times you could say that a disease was being sent from heaven for a specific act, even though people got AIDS not only for homosexual activity, but for a variety of reasons. Using blood that was causing the disease, etc. But people questioned and said, well, maybe we shouldn't be trying to come up with a cure for AIDS. Maybe we should say that this is being sent by God for a specific violation of a commandment. But I don't know any credible rabbis who accepted that. Instead, Hashem, in essence, can be said to send any illness that comes upon us. And clearly we know that we are struggling and trying very hard to cure any and all illnesses, that included. We have a tremendously high regard for doctors. As I mentioned before, there's a story told about a Jewish mother of an American president. It hasn't happened yet, but a Jewish mother of an American president who receives a call inviting her to come aboard Air Force One. She hangs up the phone and her friends ask, who is that on the phone? And she answers, my son, the doctor? That was his brother. So we have a high regard for doctors, but there is a pasuk in the Gemara, a statement that says, Tov sheberofim legehenim, which literally means the best of the doctors are going to hell. And it's a famous phrase, and there's a lot of discussion about it. But I think the classic explanation of that statement is, yes, doctors are fantastic. They're to be given a great degree of honor and praise, but they should not be too arrogant, right? This is the joke that's always used about a number of professions, including doctors. What's the difference between God and doctors. The difference is God doesn't think he's a doctor. But the truth is God is also a doctor, and we refer to him that way. Rofei Ne'eman V'Rachaman, the faithful, the merciful doctor. Since the Torah gives permission to a doctor to heal based upon this pasuk, so it's mandatory as well for any ill person to go to a doctor to be treated. Not only that the doctor has to service the patient, but the patient has to also seek out a doctor to be to treat their illness and not rely on a miracle. Ein somchin al hanes. And one who does not do so, who says, well, I'm kind of Christian Scientist, I'm going to let God heal me, I'm not going to seek out a doctor, is actually considered to be spilling blood, their own blood. And so that too is prohibited. Not only that, if a doctor knows of another doctor in his area who is better equipped to heal a particular illness, it's incumbent upon that doctor to refer the patient to the other physician and tell him that there is somebody who's better than I am in this particular area. So there has to be a certain amount of humility for the doctor as well. Just a few halachot, laws about medicine and healing. Generally, a man may go to a woman doctor and vice versa. And this is true even for areas of medicine such as gynecology. But in reference to Rav Lieberman, who is a chassid of the Rebbe had recommended long ago something that's become much more contemporary and practiced today, that ideally women should seek female doctors in areas that they would be more comfortable with from a point of modesty and sensitivity. And he strongly urged that, even though it's certainly permissible for men to see women, women to see men, etc. When you swallow any medicine, you do not make a bracha on it if it has no taste or it has a bitter taste. If it has a taste, then you can make a bracha. But we'll come back to the idea of bracha in a moment, but in terms of eating, you don't make a bracha. If it has a good taste, then you do, as well as a bracha chrona if you had a sufficient amount of that medicine. This might be true for cough medicine because it usually is flavored, so you would make a bracha on it. It's essential in any community to have a doctor. And the Gemara says that any city lacking these 10 things, a observant Jew should not live there. What are they? A beit din to adjudicate disputes, a tzedakah fund, a shul, a bathhouse, a latrine, a doctor, a bloodletter, a clerk, a butcher, an elementary school teacher, and of course a mikvah. So it's interesting that among these categories, not only doctors, but bloodletters, which was thought at one time to be a very useful and successful form of healing. Today, we're obviously not very up on the idea of bloodletting. Some of you may know that at one time the bloodletters were also the barbers, and that's why the barber poles have red in it to indicate that they not only could get your hair cut, but they would cut other things as well. Before taking medication, we said that you don't make a bracha, but there is a tefillah you can say. Basically, to Hashem, may it be your will that this treatment should bring healing because you are a rofei ne'eman v'rachaman. And after treatment, you can make a bracha, Baruch Rofei HaCholim, to thank Hashem for healing. So in addition to the fact that you seek out a doctor, you do not ignore and you don't depend solely on Hashem, but you also, of course, understand that there is an element of praying to Hashem and asking Hashem to send you healing, either in the form of the doctor or heaven sent, so that you recover, perhaps even without the intervention of the doctor. And we see this throughout the Tanakh, many, many examples of the great, biblical heroes who daven. Abraham prays for health in the house of Avimelech, right? After Sarah is kidnapped and they're stricken with certain illnesses. So Abraham prays to Hashem to heal them. Moshe prays to heal Miriam. Eliyahu prays to heal the son of the Almanav, the widow. Elisha Hanavi prays to heal. Prayer is invoked for the son of the Shunammite woman and to heal King Chizkiyahu. There are many, many examples throughout Tanakh about not neglecting tefillah. And there has been an amazing study done that when somebody prays for a person, that helps them to heal, even if the patient or the sick person doesn't know the other person is praying for them. It sounds very, very mystical, but studies have shown that it's true. But the most powerful tefillah that can be said for a sick person is by that person himself or herself. So you don't give it over to somebody and say, well, I won't daven for myself, but I'll let other people daven for me. Both help, but no one can have the intensity of tefillah that you can for yourself. There's a story told in the Gemara. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva are walking down the streets of Yerushalayim with another unnamed person. And they meet a sick person who says to them, Rabbeinu, my rabbis, tell me with what should I be healed? And so they tell him, take such and such medicine until you are cured. So the person with them says, I don't really understand you, rabbis. Who afflicted this man with sickness? So they answered, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so the man said, and you interfered in an area which is not yours? He afflicted and you heal them? So they answered him and said, what is your occupation? They said to the man. He said, I'm a farmer. And you can see that I'm a farmer by the fact that I'm holding a sickle in my hands. So they said to him, who created the field and the vineyard? And he said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They said to him, and you interfered in an area that's not yours? He created these and you eat their fruit? He said, don't you see the sickle in my hand? If I don't go out and plow the field and fertilize it and weed it, then nothing would ever grow. So they said to him, foolish man, could you not infer from your own occupation that which is written, right? That man is like the trees of the field, his days are like grass, etc. Just like with a tree, if it's not fertilized, plowed, and weeded, it doesn't grow. And if it already grew but is not watered, it dies. So too the body is like the tree, the fertilizer is the medicine, and the farmer is the doctor. So in other words, they said to him, like in everything else, there is God's participation and God's part in the process, but there's also a human being that has to do whatever he can in a natural world in order to survive and to succeed. Some want to say, as a kind of almost final statement on this, that when doctors heal, even though we seek out doctors and we respect them, their healing usually includes pain or scars. But when Hashem heals, it's pristine. The person is left without any scars, don't have to undergo invasive surgery, etc. There's a famous, just as a kind of footnote to this, there's a famous, very mystical idea that there was a book of cures that, and not the book of healing. It's interesting. We have it, and still, you can still get this, the book of healing, which was written by, there's a whole dispute who wrote it, but it's ascribed to someone named Asaf. Thus, the Israeli hospital Asaf HaRofeh, which is named after this person who many centuries ago wrote this book on healing. And that's legitimate. And there's a lot of interesting things in that book. Doctors still refer to it. The Rambam also, of course, as you know, has books on healing and diet. But then there's another book called The Book of Cures. And that, again, we're not sure exactly who wrote it. Some ascribe it to Shlomo HaMelech. Some say that it was written by one of the sons of Noach. And in a famous comment, King Chizkiyahu was said to have hidden this book and was actually praised for it. So there's a whole discussion. Why is he praised for taking away this book that had cures? And some want to maybe extrapolate, as we said before, maybe Chizkiyahu was making a statement that all healing should be done min hashamayim and not by human beings. But the Rambam, who of course was one of the greatest doctors of all, said, no, that's definitely not true. That Chizkiyahu hid it away because it had all kinds of incantations and spells and chants and things that were bordering really on idolatry. He said there certainly would be no reason to hide any book that could help humanity. And indeed, it was a mitzvah to write such a book. And that's why the Rambam wrote several. The other issue that comes out of this discussion of doctors is not so much from an esoteric idea of should man or humanity be doing God's work, and we conclude that yes, they should, but what about the doctors themselves who are shedding blood? You know, there are many laws in the Torah that prohibit any kind of injury, and Rav Moshe even says when it comes to, say, heart transplants, Rav Moshe writes that in a sense, two people are being killed because at a certain point, not only you're taking the heart out of someone, and then you're removing, right, the defective heart from the recipient and also the heart from the donor. So he asked the question, is a doctor really allowed to do that, to precipitate the death of a person or take a chance like that? And Rav Moshe actually concluded that, and he wrote a lot about heart transplants. And, you know, heart transplants, the first heart transplant was, of course, by Christian Barnard in 1967 in South Africa. He actually transplanted a heart into a Jewish man. Unfortunately, the man died 18 days later of pneumonia. But it was only a year later in 1968 when Israeli doctors performed the first heart transplant in Israel. And Rav Moshe ruled that it was permissible to do a heart transplant at the point where 50% of the recipients were living at least 1 year. And then he said it was safe enough to do the heart transplant. Otherwise, he said before that, it was too risky and it would not be permissible halachically. Today, we know that people can live, I think you have the longest living heart transplant, I think born in 1986, still alive with a transplanted heart. So medicine has come very, very far. So this Parsha, I think that this whole discussion about healing is very apropos for the Parsha, which deals a lot with social justice, with mitzvot bein adam l'chaveiro, and showing a lot of compassion for those people in society who need help. In this case, the idea of medical help. So I want to add two other ideas. The first, we see that there is a pasuk, and let me find it. Hang on. It's in Paragraph Bet. We talk about an indigent person who has to give up his coat in order to secure a loan. And the pasuk tells us that you have to return that in the evening, right? That im chabol tachbol salmat reyachad bo hashemesh teshivenu lo, return it to him because he needs that clothes. He may be cold without it. He may use it for a blanket. And the pasuk says, "Bamei yishkav," how will he sleep without it? And then adds, "Vayaki yitzak elai v'shamati ki chanun ani." If he will cry out to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. Okay, so that's the pasuk. But you compare that very dramatically with another pasuk a little earlier, where we are told that you have to have special consideration for widows and orphans. They're among the most vulnerable in society, especially back in the day when women generally did not work. If a woman did not have a livelihood, if a child did not have parents, they obviously were very susceptible to danger, to extortion, and to poverty, to starvation. So the pasuk says, "Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun." You cannot oppress either a widow or an orphan. And now listen to this pasuk. We may have discussed this before, but it bears repeating. Im anei ta'aneh oto, if you will oppress them, ki im tza'ok yitz'ak elai, and they will cry out to me, shamo eshma tza'akato, I will surely hear their cry. And then the pasuk's very charif, says, I will be angry, farakti etchem b'charev, I'll kill these people with a sword, and their wives will become widows and their children will become orphans. It's very, very powerful statement. But did you notice the phraseology here, as opposed to what we said before about the individual with getting the coat back, where it said, V'hayaki yitzak elai, here, listen to what it says, Ki im anei ta'aneh oto, ki im tza'ok yitzak elai, shamo eshma tza'akato. You see, we double the verbs each of the three times that's in this pasuk. So it doesn't say if you will oppress, but if you will oppress them, and they will cry out to me, I will hear them. And so the implication, of course, is that you have to be doubly sensitive to those individuals who are most vulnerable. You have to have regard for all people, but certain elements of society necessitate even more care. And I think I may have mentioned before the story about the widow who comes into a shoe store with her 3 children to buy shoes for the kids. And after she buys the shoes, the owner of the store is very nice, and he gives a balloon to each of the children. And they take their balloon, they walk out of the store, and as soon as they come out of the store, the littlest child lets go of the balloon. And the owner of the store runs out and starts yelling at the child, why did you do that? I gave you a balloon, and now you let it go. You should have held on to it. Is that what you think of the gift I gave you? You can't behave like that. And the little child began to cry and looked at the man and said, Daddy didn't get one. Tells you, obviously, sending this balloon to heaven, because that's what the child was thinking about. You have to be very careful with those very, very fragile members of society. Finally, one more thought. We are told that in one of these 53 mitzvot, that if you see someone struggling with a burden, specifically you see the donkey of someone actually you hate, it's another story, you have to help the person you hate before the person you love. But then it says, you can't refrain from helping them. Azov ta'azov imo, you shall surely help him. Now, when we look at these words, azov ta'azov imo, we all, if we know basic Hebrew, we know that the word azov, it almost looks like it's a typo, that maybe it should say, azor ta'azor oto, you shall surely help him, instead of azov. Azov means to leave him, desert, to desert someone. So what is the pasuk saying? And we see this, for example, right at the beginning of the Torah, when the pasuk says, when a man will marry, right? That it says he shall leave his father and mother. And there it uses the word azov, to leave. Why does the pasuk use that phrase here instead of saying, even though it's translated to help him, why does it say azov ta'azov imo? So I think the explanation, and Rav Zweig from Florida has a beautiful idea here. The idea is that you ideally help a person until the point where you can leave him alone and he no longer needs your help. Helping somebody, but necessitating for that person to keep coming back to you again and again and again is a very low level of help. If you can help the person to where literally azov ta'azovimo, where he says, I don't need you anymore. I can stand on my own 2 feet. I'm self-sufficient. That's the greatest help that you can give to someone else. So while you want to be generous and philanthropic, the highest form we know of tzedakah is giving someone a job so that they no longer have to come back and ask for a handout, because there is always obviously a psychological pain and burden on that person who feels, I can't support myself, I have to depend on others. Every person wants to feel that they have the ability to sustain themselves and they can stand on their own 2 feet. So all in all, it's a beautiful sedra that comes right after the Aseret HaDibrot, which seemed, very powerful, but nevertheless, the Torah is telling us that it's in the details, that the 10 commandments are obviously very, very crucial to Jewish life, but it's in the day-to-day dealings between people where you see the Torah is really expressed and carried out in the activity that we go through in our interaction with other people. Okay, so I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Just to answer, some people asked, I don't think we have a Parsha sheet this week because I don't really have the time to do it before Shabbat, but it is a fantastic Parsha to discuss and pick any of the 53 mitzvot, some of which have full tractates of the Gemara, just to discuss a few psukim, specifically the laws of how you deal in these situations where damage is done from one party to another, whether it's physical or whether it's economic or whether it's something that takes place between neighbors, etc. So if anybody has a question or comment, by all means, you can unmute and you can say it. If not, then I wish all of you Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Baruch haba.
Shabbat Shalom.
Welcome home.